Something unsettling is happening in South Texas. Along the edge of one of the region's most important reservoirs, the shoreline isn't just getting longer, it's uncovering a forgotten world. Concrete roads that once disappeared beneath deep water are now exposed to the blazing sun. Old boat ramps end in cracked earth. Rusted foundations sit where fish once swam. Places that had been hidden for generations are suddenly visible again. This isn't an archaeological discovery, it's a warning. For more than 500,000 people who depend on this lake for drinking water, every foot of exposed shoreline tells the same story. The reservoir is disappearing. Engineers are tracking water levels almost daily. City leaders are preparing emergency plans. Industries worth billions of dollars are watching the forecast with growing concern. And if conditions don't improve, one of Texas's busiest economic regions could soon face water restrictions unlike anything in its modern history. The alarming part is that this crisis didn't begin with one catastrophic event. There was no dam failure, no giant crack in the reservoir, no single disaster that suddenly drained the lake. Instead, the water disappeared so slowly that many people barely noticed. Month after month, the shoreline crept farther away. Boat docks had to be extended. Boat ramps became unusable. Fishing areas turned into dry fields. Each change seemed small on its own, but together they revealed something much bigger. Today, the reservoir holds only a fraction of the water it once stored. So how did one of Texas's most important water supplies reach this point? To answer that, you have to understand where this water comes from. South Texas has always lived with unpredictable rainfall. Some years bring tropical storms and overflowing rivers. Others bring relentless heat and months without meaningful rain. The region has survived droughts before, but this one is different because it has lasted long enough to overwhelm a system designed decades ago for a very different Texas. Every summer, enormous amounts of water disappear into the atmosphere through evaporation. During prolonged heat waves, the lake can lose billions of gallons before a single new drop flows into it. When rainfall remains below average year after year, those losses begin to outpace every source of replenishment. At first, reservoirs absorb the impact. Then they begin to shrink. Eventually, every dry month pushes the system closer to its limits. Scientists have watched this pattern develop across much of the state. Higher temperatures increase evaporation. Dry soil absorbs the first rainfall instead of allowing it to run into rivers. Even when storms finally arrive, much of the water never reaches the reservoir. That means a heavy rain doesn't always solve the problem. Sometimes it only delays it. Meanwhile, demand continues to rise. The communities surrounding the reservoir aren't the only ones relying on this water. Growing neighborhoods, expanding industries, power generation, agriculture, and one of the nation's busiest energy corridors all compete for the same limited supply. Every gallon taken from the lake is 1 gallon that cannot remain there. For years, that balance worked. Now, it no longer does. And what happens next could affect far more than the people living along the shoreline. The first signs of trouble appeared far from the city itself. Small communities surrounding the reservoir began noticing changes long before emergency warnings reached the headlines. Boat launches closed because they no longer reached the water. Marinas that once welcomed anglers every weekend were surrounded by dry ground instead of open lake. Businesses built around tourism saw fewer visitors as the shoreline retreated farther into the distance. For local residents, the disappearing water wasn't just changing the landscape, it was changing daily life. Then, the concern spread beyond recreation. Water managers started comparing current storage levels with historical records, and the numbers were difficult to ignore. Reservoir levels that had once been considered normal were now becoming distant memories. Every month seemed to establish another unwanted milestone, while weather forecasts offered little hope of sustained rainfall. But the real danger wasn't simply the lack of rain. It was what the shrinking reservoir supports. Hundreds of thousands of people depend on this system for clean drinking water every single day. Homes, hospitals, schools, and businesses all rely on treatment plants supplied by these reservoirs. Every gallon leaving the lake must be carefully managed, because replacing it has become increasingly difficult. Yet households are only part of the equation. South Texas is one of America's most important industrial regions. Massive refineries, petrochemical complexes, Manufacturing facilities and shipping terminals consume enormous volumes of water every day. Water cools equipment, powers industrial processes, and keeps production moving around the clock. Without a reliable supply, those operations cannot continue at full capacity. That transforms a regional drought into an economic problem with national consequences. The Port of Corpus Christi has become one of the busiest energy export hubs in the United States. Millions of barrels of crude oil and refined products move through the region every week, supporting supply chains that stretch far beyond Texas. Most people think of fuel shortages as problems caused by hurricanes or pipeline failures. Few imagine that a shrinking lake could create similar risks. But water is just as essential to modern industry as electricity. Without enough of it, production slows. When production slows, transportation, manufacturing, and energy markets begin to feel the pressure. Officials have already introduced conservation measures designed to stretch every available gallon. Outdoor watering restrictions, reduced municipal usage, and public awareness campaigns are all intended to buy time. But conservation has limits. You can reduce demand. You cannot create rain. That reality has forced engineers and policymakers to ask a far more uncomfortable question. What happens if the reservoirs continue falling through another summer? The answer isn't simple. Every additional week of extreme heat increases evaporation. Dry riverbeds deliver less inflow. Even isolated thunderstorms often provide little relief because hardened ground absorbs much of the water before it ever reaches the streams feeding the reservoir. It's a cycle that becomes increasingly difficult to break. The longer drought continues, the harder recovery becomes, and that's exactly what worries water experts the most. This is no longer a crisis measured only by today's water level. It's a race between nature and infrastructure. Can emergency projects be completed before the reservoirs fall even lower? Or will South Texas reach a point where demand finally overtakes supply? Those questions no longer belong only to scientists. They now affect every family, every business, and every industry connected to one of Texas's most important water systems. For years, officials knew this day could come. The warning signs weren't hidden. Population growth was accelerating. Summers were becoming hotter. Water demand kept climbing. Every long-range forecast pointed toward the same conclusion: South Texas would eventually need more water than its existing system could reliably provide. The question was never if new supplies would be needed. It was when. Several solutions were proposed. Some engineers pushed for new groundwater projects, hoping deep aquifers could provide additional drinking water during severe droughts. Others argued for expanding pipelines to connect with reservoirs outside the region. There were also proposals to increase water recycling and improve conservation technologies that could reduce overall demand. Perhaps the most ambitious idea was building a large-scale desalination plant. The Gulf of Mexico sits only a short distance from Corpus Christi. Unlike rainfall, the ocean doesn't disappear during drought. By removing salt from seawater, engineers believed the city could create a dependable source of drinking water that wouldn't rely entirely on shrinking reservoirs. On paper, the idea made sense. In reality, it proved far more complicated. Construction costs climbed year after year. Inflation pushed material prices higher. Environmental reviews became more complex. Questions about long-term operating costs divided local leaders, while residents worried about the impact on future water bills. As debates continued, time kept moving. Meanwhile, the reservoirs kept falling. Now, with water levels near historic lows, emergency projects are replacing long-term planning. New wells are being drilled. Pipelines are being upgraded. Engineers are working to connect additional groundwater sources before another scorching summer arrives. But infrastructure cannot appear overnight. Every new pipeline takes months to design and build. Every treatment facility must be tested before it begins producing drinking water. Every permit adds more time. Nature, however, doesn't wait for construction schedules. If another prolonged dry season arrives before these projects are completed, officials could face decisions no city ever wants to make. Who receives water first? Hospitals, fire departments, schools, homes. Then comes the difficult question. What happens to industries that require millions of gallons every day? Temporary production cuts may become unavoidable. Some facilities could reduce operations, others might delay expansion plans until supplies stabilize. The consequences would extend far beyond South Texas. Energy production, manufacturing, shipping, and local employment are all connected to reliable access to water. A shortage doesn't just affect what's flowing through household faucets. It affects paychecks, businesses, transportation networks, and regional economic growth. Yet despite everything, there is one important detail that often gets overlooked. This story isn't only about one lake. Across Texas, communities are asking many of the same questions. Reservoirs in different regions are under pressure. Growing cities continue demanding more water. Aging infrastructure loses millions of gallons every year through leaks. At the same time, hotter temperatures increase evaporation across nearly every major lake in the state. These challenges are forcing planners to rethink assumptions that guided water management for decades. The systems that supported yesterday's Texas may not be enough for tomorrow's Texas. Climate alone isn't responsible. Population growth isn't responsible by itself either. Neither is industry. The crisis sits at the intersection of all three. More people, more demand, less reliable rainfall, and infrastructure struggling to keep pace. That combination creates a problem no single storm can solve. Even if heavy rain arrives next month, experts caution that one wet season cannot erase years of accumulated water loss. Reservoirs recover gradually. Groundwater recharges slowly. Long-term security depends on years of careful planning, not a single weather event. For now, millions of gallons continue leaving the reservoirs every day through consumption and evaporation. Engineers monitor levels around the clock. Weather forecasts are studied with unusual intensity. Every storm system crossing the Gulf is watched with cautious optimism. Because every inch of rainfall now matters. The coming months may determine whether emergency projects can outpace a deepening drought or whether stricter restrictions become unavoidable. History has shown that Texas eventually recovers from drought. But history has also shown that every generation faces new challenges. This time, those challenges involve a larger population, greater industrial demand, and a climate that appears increasingly unpredictable. The exposed shoreline surrounding this lake is more than dry ground. It's a visible reminder of how quickly conditions can change when water becomes scarce. And perhaps the most unsettling part is this. The crisis didn't begin with a dramatic disaster. It began quietly. One dry season, then another, until an entire region found itself asking a question that once seemed impossible. How much longer can the water last? The answer won't depend on a single rainstorm. It will depend on the decisions made long before the next drought arrives.